On Friday, President Obama walked into the briefing room, a bit of a surprise, and had a few things to say about the George Zimmerman verdict, the Trayvon Martin case in Florida. Joining us to put it in perspective, Wamara Mwine, who covers the White House for Examiner.com and PoliticsInColor.com. He's been here before. I was not here, but he's here today, and the two of us for the first time. So thanks for coming in.
Oh, you're welcome. Good morning.
PoliticsInColor.com, is that something new? Is that a fairly new?
2008.
2008.
I started blogging with them in 2008, and it covers politics for African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, 21 to 57.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for people who are looking for it, of course, we'll have links. And by the way, the tweet, it's the full name, WAMARAMWINE, if you're looking for the Twitter handle for Wamara. Talk about the president coming in there on Friday. You and I were just discussing it for a moment before on the air. You were not in the briefing room. A lot of people were not there. It was about half empty, I think, or half full. But it was half empty for Friday. It was a hot day, kind of considered a dead day. Most of the number one correspondents were not there in the front row for TV. Was this something that he had to do at long last, or give us your take on at least the motivation behind the timing of the speech?
Well, I think the pressure had been building up, and I just knowing and watching the president over 2.5 years or so, I think his schedule had reached a point where this was something that was on his conscience, and he couldn't move forward with other things until he said something about this. And then, as you said, conveniently, people weren't there, so there weren't an opportunity to drill him with a lot of questions.
Well, he had sort of said there were going to be no questions, and that's not an unusual thing either. I wonder, too, was it something that, was gestating? There were some reports that maybe Reverend Sharpton had said, you need to say something more definitive than just this sort of short, albeit, an okay statement that had come out Sunday, the day after the verdict, where he said, the jury has spoken, let's remain calm and let's remain peaceful. But Eric Holder had been out there kind of breathing a little fire on a few instances when he spoke to the NAACP, but the president had remained relatively quiet. So put that in the context of what he did on Friday.
I haven't been very excited about Eric Holder. I think that there's been cases that he's had opportunities to go after some of these racists that I've written about. John Kane, for example, from Maryland, a GOP chairman who had business in D.C. here, who had been underpaying minority workers. I mean, he could have prosecuted that guy. He probably wouldn't have gone to jail, but at least it would have sent a signal, okay, even on the small side, we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. But in this particular circumstance, I think the DOJ has got their hands are tied, and Obama knows that. I mean, maybe on the state level they could do something, but the DOJ could just only basically support the state action.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, there seems to be in this particular case that there was a sense that the president, one of the things that was sort of buried in his address on Friday was the idea that the Justice Department is not going to come up with any action or anything that they're going to be able to take action with against George Zimmerman.
Well, the FBI has been investigating, and now that the case is over, I mean, the FBI should be able to come to some conclusions and then give the DOJ their opinion on that, and then they could take action. I mean, this should be seen, and you haven't heard this term used in this case, as a hate crime. Mm-hmm. If you go out and you attack someone, for example, somebody who is of gay persuasion, it would automatically fall into this category, which leans more in the direction of taking some action, right, or at least having some kind of conviction. And then, of course, there's also the civil case.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, I mean, there were about 2 weeks ago in the Miami Herald, I know was one place that had published the results of an FBI investigation that indicated they had done at least 14 interviews, which didn't indicate that it was leaning toward finding there was any racism with George Zimmerman. There, it seems to me, are two issues, though, whether or not George Zimmerman is a racist or acted in a fashion that would be considered racist, and whether there's institutional racism or at least institutional encouragement to look the other way. And I think the president was trying to deftly, if not navigate between the two, maybe even bring them both into the story, in the sense that George Zimmerman, there doesn't seem to be a preponderance of evidence that he acted in a way that indicates that he's a racist, both in terms of what he did that night, but also in his past behavior. But I think the president was also trying to say, look, this is there. I mean, you walk into stores. The president said, I have walked into stores and people stare at me.
Profiled, yeah.
You hear the doors get locked. I mean, you've probably seen that too.
Oh, I've seen it. I mean, there's incidences that happen. I mean, at least once a week. There's something small. There's something that you'll see that will remind you that people are looking at you in a certain way. But going back to what you're saying, in terms of this case, obviously Trayvon Martin, his parents lived in that community. If they had not lived there, then it could have been trespassing as far as I could see. But also there were all these calls that Zimmerman had made. So even if it's not so much as he's a racist, but just the fact that he's acting on these kind of stereotypical thoughts. Oh, there's an African-American guy. Well, he must be up to no good. The police tell him to stay in his car. He decides to go out and confront this guy. So, and this kid, not even a guy, he's not an adult. So if clearly if he had stayed in his car, there's a very good chance that Trayvon Martin would be alive today. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the president was going in terms of that, statement. And I think some of his analogies didn't work as well. I mean, he always tried to say, well, I could have been Trayvon 35 years ago, what have you. I don't think those arguments stuck as well. And that's why I think you had critics like, Tavis Smiley, who said, well, this is like a sweetened lemonade or, Kool-Aid or so forth, instead of being like head on, like, okay, this guy should have stayed in his car, period.
Mm-hmm. What is the problem between the president and Tavis Smiley?
Well, I think it's something that has been overblown. This problem is more about Tom Joyner and Melissa Harris, who's with MSNBC. They've sort of fanned the flames on this situation where Tavis has had these black leadership conferences and the president didn't attend one. And Tavis was disappointed and he voiced that disappointment. But I think that within the black community, within these black leaders like Tom Joyner, they're saying, well, Tavis shouldn't have said that, or she shouldn't have criticized the president openly. But clearly he wanted him to be engaged in these conferences. And I think Tavis's people also on their end is that they're somewhat hypersensitive. So getting in touch with him and dialoguing with him can be challenging. But back at the White House, too, you had Carrie Elons and Kevin Lewis, who are the black media directors. I mean, their job is to pick up the phone and say, Tavis, you're going to have a private conversation with the president. It's going to be off the record. You're going to have this conversation in 2009 so that by 2013, there isn't all this tension that exists.
They should have done that earlier, you're saying.
Wait, sooner, much sooner.
Well, I mean, it sounded like he almost made it a personal thing. It's sort of like, well, you are not deigning to come to my particular event, and therefore he got angry. And you could sort of understand, well, he is the president. I mean, and Tavis Smiley is a leader, but, I mean, exactly where does the president go and who decides whether he goes to this event or that event?
Well, you've got these other guys, these other traditional black leaders, and I have the issues with some of these guys. The Tavis is one person over here on the left, but then you have Al Sharpton, you got Jesse Jackson. These guys have been around and they have at different times benefited from this racial situation in the country. So I don't think Tavis is into that as much. I think he's more interested in helping with situations like poverty in the country and African-American unemployment. While these guys, for example, Sharpton is now on MSNBC as his own show, and he's using that show as a platform to spread this message he has, but it's mostly about him.
Mm. Well, and going back to Jonathan Alter's book about the president, though he's the center holds, he indicates the president is grateful to Al Sharpton for being able to sort of hold the line against some groups some individuals like Cornel West, who's really kind of out there.
Cornel is out there. Yeah, there's no question. His personality, his persona, he's from
sounds
another
like
generation.
That's almost personal, it seems to me. That's not even ideological. That's just a personal. It sounds like it anyway from the outside.
Yeah, I think
I don't know him
Cornel
or the president well enough to either
coming
comment
from
on it.
A different generation, and I think that Tavis has also seen that he has to stand independent of Cornel at different times and circumstances.
Last thing, what did you personally think as the president spoke on Friday? Did you feel like, thank you, Mr. President, or did you feel like, I wish you could have done more? I mean, what was your overall takeaway from that?
I think he could have certainly, gone into the details about, Zimmerman staying in the car, and
you think he should have focused more on the case itself?
Yeah, I think so.
But that was decided law.
Exactly. That would have been challenging.
That would have been second guessing the jury.
I don't know if it would second guess the jury, but I think what it would suggest to
who would it be second guessing?
All Americans. Well, it would be second guessing the police and their action in the sense that, two things. Obviously, he shouldn't have gotten out of the car after the police told him not to. But also, when the police arrived on the scene, they failed to process him like they would process anyone else, And I think that.
But isn't that consistent with the stand your ground law, which is the point of making the examination of the law needs to take place? Is that there is too much leeway given to somebody can just say I was defending myself, and the police are really by that law,
but
not
if he
just
had
required,
not,
but they're not
right.
even allowed.
But
to
if
be
he
able
had
to
not
do that.
gone out and engaged Trayvon Martin, if he had stayed in his car and the police had arrived, then there wouldn't have been that stand your ground situation to begin with. Yeah,
but that's a failure in the behavior of George Zimmerman. And again, he never took the stand, so we don't see anything. But again, the idea is that if anything, I just wonder if it would have been counterproductive for the president to try to go back over the case and relitigate. We had just seen weeks of testimony on television that all of America watched, and tearing through that. I wonder if he was trying to draw larger lessons than whether or not there was a flaw in the case.
In the case or the perception and the racial profiling question, and I think that in the case, obviously, during the trial, they didn't bring it up, but it's the pink elephant in the room. Mm-hmm. Everybody's thinking about this, and as you pointed out, he mentioned those examples, and then people like me, obviously, I'm out here and I'm interacting with folks, and, I have these experiences as well.
What does he do now, the president? Anything, or is he just sort of let this sit, or do you wait the Justice Department and then that's the next phase of this?
I think obviously the FBI should draw an opinion and come back and say, okay, here's what our opinion is. Mm-hmm. And then the DOJ can act on that opinion. But I think Holder could get caught in this trap where he ends up doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And that reflects poorly on the administration, especially after the president put himself out there. The other thing I wanted to tell you, and I think is really important, is at some point, Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly are going to want Zimmerman in New York for their shows, and that's going to create a real security situation. I mean, nobody's really thought about it yet, but at some point he will go to New York, and New York is a confined area. Manhattan is, and I think you're going to see some confrontations up there. They're going to want to put him on their shows for ratings purely. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're more interested in the outcome. The death of Trayvon Martin to them is sort of an opportunity. So that's something that I see coming. I mean, whether it's in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, I'm not sure, but I'm quite positive that they're going to want to put him on the set and blow up the ratings.
And you think that from a security standpoint, what?
Oh, for Zimmerman himself to be there in proximity on the island, on Manhattan, and just being there is going to, people will know he's there. Mm-hmm. And that could cause some real controversy, I think.
Well, controversy for sure. When you said that about security, I wondered if you were concerned about violence.
Oh, sure. That's always a possibility. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's the other thing, that the tragedy of this trial from both ends is that now for the future for George Zimmerman, what kind of safety issues is he going to have? I mean, is he going to be able to live a normal life? They said that he was out saving some tourists, some motorists. I mean, I was surprised to hear this story. I mean, it just seemed kind of ironic, but on a daily day basis, until there is some kind of action, I think that his security will always be a question mark.
Well, we will see how it progresses. Once again, Wamara Mwine, and he tweets at Wamara Mwine, White House correspondent, National Examiner, Politics in Color. Thank you for coming to POTUS today.
Oh, you're welcome.
And there will be much more conversation on this going around.